And in mind reading, what we do is it generally starts with a phrase, something that goes, when it's about other people, they probably think that I'm, and then fill in the blank. And then that becomes our reality, that they probably think that I'm boring. They probably think that I'm uninterested. They probably think, and there's no way that we can mind read other people. And it can cause a lot of problems. Um, there was a friend of mine that was his repeated thing his wife would say, is I know what you're really thinking. And there's no way to come back with that. It's like, well, no, I'm not thinking that. Well, yes, you are. So I think mind reading is one that we need to be real careful of. Although for children that are being maltreated, mind reading may have had survival value, but they would read very carefully, not necessarily listening to the words, but watching facial expressions and body postures and thinking, oh, this means I'm going to get hit. This means bad things are going to happen to me. So I think that they may have developed that because part of the time they'd be right. And that's the ones they would attend to, is the times that they were accurate in their quote unquote mind reading. So when you find yourself mind reading, it's generally they're probably thinking that I'm, and very often it's about what we're thinking about ourselves, and we project it out onto other people. All right. The other one that's really destructive, and we'll probably spend a little time on that, on this one, is blaming. So just for a little drill, I'd like you, if you wouldn't mind, just to take a moment and think about something that you're kind of angry about or frustrated. Well, it doesn't have to be a big thing, just a minor thing. Just get that in your mind. Don't dwell on it. And then I'd like you to repeat this mantra in your mind after me. You ready? I'm responsible. I'm responsible. I'm responsible. I'm responsible. And you may be able to feel almost an immediate diminution in intensity, because the reality is that as adults, every moment of every day, we are doing exactly what we choose to do, and we could choose to do differently. But if we're blaming our situation on other people, it's like that's like we're powerless again. So if we're responsible in every situation, under every condition, then we're taking our power back. The other problem with people and blaming is when they're blaming other people, for example, about, well, if my wife would only change, I'd be okay. If my boss would only do this, then I'll be okay. There's no reason for them to do any introspection about what they need to change, the kind of things that they need to do differently, because it's all focused outward. The reason this has happened to me is because my boss isn't treating me fairly. And there's been people that have lost jobs behind that because they could never see their part in it. So the kind of rule of thumb to experiment with is under every condition, in every situation, I'm responsible, I'm responsible, I'm responsible. Now, people would say, well, if somebody T-bones you by going through a red light, are you responsible for that? No, of course you're not. But you're responsible for the way you respond to it. If somebody offends you, are you responsible for them being offensive to you? No, you're not. But you are responsible for the way you respond to it. Instead of shooting them in the head or chopping them with a machete, you might find some other things to do. So it removes us from that victim role. And people that continually blame others or blame situations are stuck in that victim role, which is powerless, helpless, and having no control, which, by the way, is stimuli reminiscent of their trauma. Because one of the things about traumatic experiences that makes them so traumatic is we're not in control. And we're continually blaming other people. We're not in control. But it gives us a way to get out of things. You know, it wasn't my fault that that happened. It was somebody else's. I remember a guy telling me, well, my wife has done this, 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 and the other thing. And I say, okay, well, you're responsible. And he's, how can I be responsible? That's the thing she does. No, you're responsible for having chosen that person. You're responsible for staying in that relationship. You're responsible, but if you go into that victim role, it's really hard to get out of it. There's such a thing as victim entitlement. And a lot of people really don't want to give up that victim entitlement. We see politicians that are perpetual victims, and they're never going to be able to get out of that role. And other people buy into it. So when you find yourself saying, you know, oh, if they did this to me or this happened to me, just take a minute, do that mantra, and see what happens. I'm responsible. I'm responsible. I'm responsible. Now, don't get responsibility confused with blame. So it's not saying, oh, well, now I'm blaming myself. It's like responsibility and blame are two altogether different concepts. So be careful not to see it as, yeah, it's my fault, I'm to blame. Like, no, but I'm responsible. Just a thing to toy around with. And people have a lot of difficulty with that one because it's like they'll come up with exceptions. It's like, well, how could I be responsible if I was raped? And it's like, well, tell me the circumstance. Well, I was walking down the middle of Central Avenue at 3 o'clock in the morning and I was half drunk. Okay, so do you have any responsibility in this whatsoever? Well, yeah, maybe if I hadn't been walking down the street at 3 o'clock in the morning drunk, that might not have happened. So they don't have total responsibility for it, don't get me wrong. But looking at what their part of it was puts them back in power. It's like the probability of that happening to me is going to be significantly diminished if I'm not drunk and walking around town at 3 o'clock in the morning. So just think about that one. It's a tough one to wrestle with. Then we have what's called heaven's reward fallacy. I think women do this more than men, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's probably easy. But heaven's reward fallacy goes something like this. You work and you slave and you do everything perfectly and you're conscientious about everything and you bring your husband slippers or you bring your wife flowers and then we have this thought, after all the things I've done for you. So we have this idea that if we do the right thing, if we're perfect in everything we do, then we're going to be rewarded. Well, first of all, the other person may not even know what our needs are and what we want. So instead of speaking them like, hey, listen, I did this for you and I'd really appreciate it if you know, we don't do that. It's just sit back and going, well, now I'm resentful and I have a right to be resentful because they didn't do what I wanted them to do and they should have. So I think with that heaven's reward fallacy, I think a name for it years ago was called codependency. It's like, my husband is cold, so I put on a coat. He's thirsty, so I take a drink. So it's kind of a tricky one, but usually it's entitlement, codependency. I remember this one guy that I talked to, he was a veteran, and I told him, I said, you know, I wonder if maybe you could use some assertiveness training. And he said, assertiveness training? I've killed more people in smallpox. But he had aggression confused with being assertive. Instead of asking for his needs, he would sacrifice and do for somebody else, hoping that he would be rewarded. Sometimes he wasn't, but many times he wasn't. Which kind of leads us into the next one. And this is a fallacy of fairness. And you might hear politicians quite often saying, that isn't fair, that isn't fair. Well, many of the statements go something like this. They're like connected kind of. If he really loved me, he would do this for me. If they really cared for me, this is what they would do. And it's like, if they don't, and they should, then it's unfair. So when you read through these and study them, you'll come across that fallacy of fairness with a much broader explanation than I'm giving here. I'm just giving tidbits for you to, kind of do more research on at a deeper level because we don't have a lot of time. Then, of course, we have the other one, the fallacy for change. That, oh yeah, he might be drinking and drugging and committing assaults in bars, but if he'll change me. People change. Well, sometimes they don't. However, our strategies for getting people to change can be very, very destructive to a relationship. For example, getting others to change, we might manipulate them. I remember this woman, I overheard her talking with my wife one time, and she said, well, if he really wants to have sex with me, he better get me that coat. And it's like, well, using manipulation to try and get people to change. The other one is anger. Like if I just get angry enough and pissed off enough and slam things around, then people will change to meet my needs. The other one is withholding. Like I'm going to give them the silent treatment until they're so concerned they're going to change to meet my needs. People will seldom change to meet our needs unless we can ask assertively and appropriately to have those needs met. But when we start manipulating, then people, the funny thing about manipulation is people may not recognize it at the time, but later on they may begin to recognize, wow, I've been manipulated here. And then they start storing up resentments. Okay, any questions so far? Moving on.